Danny Cole sat alone at the corner table of the mess hall, his tray of food untouched in front of him as he watched the other cadets move through the large dining area, like schools of fish avoiding a shark. 3 months he had been at the Galactic Defense Academy, and 3 months he had eaten every meal at this same table, in this same corner, with this same empty space around him that nobody dared to cross. The whispers never stopped, not really. And even now he could hear them floating across the room like leaves carried on a cold wind. That is the human, a Morvith cadet said to her companion, her voice carrying further than she probably intended. The one from the Deathworld. I heard their planet has creatures that can kill you with a single bite, her companion replied, his 4 eyes blinking nervously in Danny's direction. And the humans eat those creatures for food. Danny pretended not to hear them as he picked up his fork and pushed the strange purple vegetables around his plate, wondering if he would ever get used to the food here, or the stares, or the feeling of being something dangerous that everyone feared. He thought back to his first day at the academy, when he had stepped off the transport shuttle, with his single bag over his shoulder and his acceptance letter clutched in his hand like a golden ticket to a new life among the stars. The welcome had been anything but warm. Instructor Velis Cora, a tall Thelian woman with silver skin and eyes like polished amber, had been the one to greet him at the docking bay, and she had looked at him with something that might have been curiosity or might have been concern. You are the human, she had said, her voice flat and careful, the first of your kind to attend this academy. Yes, ma'am, Danny had replied, standing straight and trying to look like he belonged there, even though every fiber of his being screamed that he was out of place. My name is Danny Cole, and I am honored to be here. She had nodded slowly, her amber eyes studying him the way a scientist might study a new and potentially dangerous specimen. And then she had handed him a datapad with his room assignment and class schedule. The other cadets may not understand what you are, she had told him, her voice dropping to something almost like a warning. Earth is classified as a Category 7 death world, and that classification carries weight in the minds of those who have never set foot on such a planet. Danny had not known what to say to that, so he had simply nodded and taken the datapad and walked into his new life, with his head held high and his heart pounding in his chest now. 3 months later, he understood exactly what she had meant. The Galactic Defense Academy was home to cadets from over 40 different species, beings of all shapes and sizes and colors who had come together to train as defenders of the galactic peace. And yet not one of them wanted anything to do with the human from Earth. They feared him. He realized, not because of anything he had done, but because of where he came from. Because his home planet was a place of crushing gravity and extreme temperatures and predators that had evolved over millions of years to become perfect killing machines. And Danny had survived there for 19 years before coming here. The sound of heavy footsteps made him look up from his tray, and he felt his jaw tighten as he saw Torvin Shao approaching his table with a group of 6 other cadets. Trailing behind him like loyal soldiers following their General Torvin was a Volcari, a reptilian species known throughout the galaxy for their arrogance and their belief that they were superior to all other beings. And he stood nearly 7 feet tall with scales the color of dried blood and eyes like chips of yellow ice. Well, Torvin said, his voice dripping with contempt as he stopped at the edge of Danny's table. If it is not the savage from the Death Rock, eating alone again like the animal he is. Danny said nothing, keeping his eyes on his food as he took a bite of the purple vegetables and chewed slowly, refusing to give Torvin the reaction he so clearly wanted. What is wrong, human? One of Torvin's followers asked, a Krellian with 4 arms and a face that looked like it had been carved from blue stone. Are you too stupid to speak, or are you just scared? Leave him alone, another voice called out, and Danny looked up to see Lyra Moss walking toward them with her own tray in her hands and fire in her green eyes. Lyra was human like Danny, though she had arrived at the academy 2 weeks after him through a different program. And she was the closest thing he had to a friend in this place. The only person who would sit with him and talk to him like he was a normal person instead of a monster. Ah. The other savage joins us, Torvin sneered, turning his cold yellow eyes toward Lyra. Tell me, human female, do you also eat raw meat and sleep in caves like the rest of your primitive species? I think you should walk away, Lyra said, her voice steady even though Danny could see her hands trembling slightly as she faced the towering Velkari. Before you say something you will regret, Torvin laughed, a harsh and grating sound that made several nearby cadets flinch, and he leaned down until his face was just inches from Lyra's. I regret nothing, he hissed, his forked tongue flicking out between his teeth. And one day soon, I will teach both of you Deathworlders exactly where you belong in the order of things. He straightened up and gestured for his followers to join him as he walked away, leaving Danny and Lyra standing there in the sudden silence that had fallen over the mess hall. Lyra sat down across from Danny and let out a long breath, her hand still shaking as she set her tray on the table. The guy's going to be a problem, she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure Torvin was gone. I heard him talking to his friends yesterday, Danny, and he is planning something. What kind of something? Danny asked, finally looking up from his food to meet her worried gaze. He wants to teach you a lesson, Lyra said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. He told them he's going to show everyone that humans are not as dangerous as the stories say, that we are just weak little creatures pretending to be predators. Danny was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Torvin and his followers and the look of pure hatred in those yellow eyes. And then he shrugged and went back to eating his purple vegetables. Let him try, he said simply. And there was something in his voice that made Lyra shiver despite the warmth of the mess hall. Something old and cold and patient like a predator waiting in the tall grass. She had grown up on Earth just like Danny had. And she knew exactly what humans were capable of when they were pushed too far. Knew the history of her species written in blood and fire across thousands of years of survival against impossible odds. She almost felt sorry for Torvin almost. The training grounds of the Galactic Defense Academy spread out across an entire deck of the massive orbital station. A vast arena of combat rings and exercise equipment and holographic simulation chambers where cadets from dozens of species came to learn the art of war. Danny stood at attention with the rest of his combat class, his muscles loose and ready as Instructor Velis walked slowly along the line of cadets with her hands clasped behind her back and her amber eyes scanning each student like she could see straight through to their souls. Today we will practice basic defensive techniques, she announced, her voice carrying easily across the training floor despite its soft tone. You will be paired with a partner of my choosing, and you will spar until one of you yields or is rendered unable to continue. Danny felt the eyes of the other cadets slide toward him, felt their fear and curiosity pressing against his skin like physical weight. And he kept his own eyes forward and his face blank as he waited for his assignment. Cadet Cole, Instructor Velis said, stopping directly in front of him. You will spar with Cadet Vornis. A Morvith stepped forward from the line, a male with mottled gray skin and 4 arms that ended in hands the size of dinner plates. And Danny could see the nervousness in the aliens' multiple eyes as they faced each other in the center ring. Remember, Instructor Velis said to the watching class, these are training exercises designed to teach you control and technique, not to cause serious injury. And I expect all of you to fight with honor and restraint. Danny nodded and settled into a relaxed stance, his weight balanced evenly on both feet and his hands hanging loose at his sides as he watched Vornis mirror him on the opposite side of the ring. The Morvith was bigger than him by at least a foot, with 4 powerful arms and a body built like a tank. And any normal person looking at the two of them would have bet everything they owned on Vornis winning this fight, but Danny was not worried. The signal to begin sounded, and Vornis charged forward with all 4 arms, swinging in a pattern designed to overwhelm any opponent through sheer numbers. And Danny simply was not there when the blows arrived. He moved like water, flowing around the attacks with a grace that made the watching cadets gasp. And every time Vornis thought he had the human cornered, Danny would slip away and appear somewhere else entirely. Danny could have ended the fight in seconds if he wanted to. Could have struck at any of the dozen openings Vornis left in his wild attacks. But instead he simply defended and dodged and waited for the Morvith to tire himself out after 3 minutes of fruitless swinging. Vornis was breathing hard, and his attacks had slowed to half their original speed. And Danny decided it was time to end the demonstration. He caught one of Vornis's wrists as it sailed past his head, used the alien's own momentum to spin him around, and then applied gentle pressure to a nerve cluster at the base of the Morvith's neck that made his whole body go limp. Vornis dropped to his knees with a grunt of surprise, and Danny released him immediately and stepped back with his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Yield," Vornis gasped, his forearms hanging uselessly at his sides. "I yield." The training ground was silent as Danny helped his opponent to his feet and made sure he was not seriously hurt before returning to his place in line. And he could feel the weight of every stare pressing down on him like a physical force. He had tried so hard to hold back, to make the fight look closer than it actually was. But he could see from the expressions on the other cadets' faces that he had failed, that they had seen exactly how outclassed Vornis had been from the very first moment. Instructor Vullis caught his eye and gave him a small nod that might have been approval or might have been understanding. And then she moved on to the next pair and the training continued, but Danny could feel one particular gaze burning into his back hotter than all the others. And he did not need to turn around to know that Torvin Schall was watching him with murder in his yellow eyes. After training ended, and the cadets were dismissed to shower and change before their next classes, Danny walked alone through the corridors of the academy. With his gym bag over his shoulder and his mind far away, he was thinking about home, about Earth, about the years he had spent learning to fight in his uncle's wrestling gym back in Ohio before he had ever dreamed of going to space. And he wondered what his uncle would think if he could see him now. The sound of footsteps behind him made him slow down, and he was not surprised when Torvin appeared around the corner ahead of him, with his arms crossed over his broad chest and his yellow eyes blazing with barely contained rage. "That was quite a show you put on back there," Torvin said, his voice low and dangerous as 2 more of his followers emerged from side corridors to block Danny's path, making Vornis look like a fool in front of everyone. "I did not mean to embarrass anyone," Danny said calmly, keeping his voice level and his body relaxed even as he counted the number of opponents surrounding him. "I was just following Instructor Villas's orders." "You were showing off," Torvin snarled, taking a step closer until he was looming over Danny like a tower of scales and muscle, trying to make everyone think that humans are something special, something to be feared. "I was defending myself," Danny said. "Nothing more." Torvin reached out and grabbed Danny's shoulder, his clawed fingers digging into the fabric of Danny's uniform hard enough to leave marks, and his forked tongue flicked out between his teeth as he leaned down to speak directly into the human's face. "You think you are so tough," he hissed, his breath hot and foul against Danny's skin. "You think being from a death world makes you better than the rest of us, but I know the truth, human. I know that you are just a weak little creature playing pretend." Danny looked down at the clawed hand on his shoulder, then back up at Torvin's face, and when he spoke his voice was quiet and cold as winter ice. "Take your hand off me." Something in those words, or maybe something in the way Danny said them, made Torvin hesitate for just a moment. And in that moment, Danny reached up and removed the Valkyrie's hand from his shoulder with a grip that made Torvin's eyes widen in shock. Then Danny simply walked away, stepping around the stunned alien and continuing down the corridor like nothing had happened. And he did not look back even when he heard Torvin's roar of rage echo off the metal walls behind him. "You will pay for that, human!" Torvin screamed, his voice cracking with fury. "Tomorrow you will learn what happens to those who disrespect me." Danny kept walking, his heart steady and his mind calm, because he had dealt with bullies before, and he knew that running or showing fear would only make things worse that night. Lyra found him in the observation deck, staring out at the stars through the massive viewport that dominated one wall of the quiet room. "I heard what happened," she said, sitting down beside him on the bench. "Torvin is telling everyone that he is going to make you beg for mercy." "Let him talk," Danny said, his eyes never leaving the stars. "Danny, I am serious," Lyra insisted, grabbing his arm to make him look at her. "I heard him planning something with his friends. Something about the maintenance quarters in Section 7B, where there are no security cameras. And I think he's going to try to hurt you." Danny was quiet for a long moment, watching the distant lights of 1,000 suns burning in the endless dark. And then he turned to Lyra with a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I know," he said softly, "and I will be ready." The message arrived on Danny's datapad during the evening meal period, glowing softly on the screen with an urgency that demanded immediate attention. "Cadet Cole, please report to Maintenance Section 7B immediately for a matter of academic importance. Signed, Instructor Velis Cora." Danny stared at the message for a long moment, his eyes tracing the words while his mind worked through the implications of what he was seeing. And a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The message was a fake, of course, and not even a particularly good one. Instructor Velis always used formal language in her communications, always addressed cadets by their full titles. And she would never send a vague summons like this without explaining exactly why she needed to see someone. More importantly, she had told Danny just that morning that she would be off station until tomorrow attending a conference on the nearby moon. A detail that whoever had sent this message clearly did not know Torvin. Danny thought, shaking his head at the amateur attempt at deception. "You really should have done your homework." He could ignore the message, of course. Could stay in the safety of the mess hall, surrounded by witnesses, until the evening was over, and then report the fake summons to the Academy Security Office in the morning. That would be the smart thing to do. The safe thing, the thing that any sensible person would choose when faced with an obvious trap set by someone who had openly threatened to hurt them. But Danny had never been particularly sensible. When it came to bullies, he had learned a long time ago, back in the schoolyards and back alleys of his hometown in Ohio, that running from people like Torvin only delayed the inevitable, that they would keep coming and keep pushing until you either stood up to them or broke down completely. And Danny Cole had never broken down in his life. He finished his meal slowly, savoring each bite of the strange alien food that he had finally started to get used to. And then he stood up and walked out of the mess hall without saying a word to anyone. The corridors of the academy were quieter during meal times. Most of the cadets gathered in the mess hall or the recreation areas, and Danny's footsteps echoed off the metal walls as he made his way toward the maintenance section. Section 7B was located in the lower levels of the station, a maze of pipes and machinery and flickering lights that the maintenance crews used to keep the academy running, but the cadets rarely had any reason to visit it. Was the perfect place for an ambush, Danny realized as he descended the final staircase and stepped into the dim corridor. With no security cameras and no witnesses and plenty of shadows for enemies to hide. And the air down here was different than the rest of the station. Warmer and heavier with the smell of oil and recycled atmosphere. And Danny could hear the constant hum of machinery vibrating through the walls like the heartbeat of some massive, sleeping creature. He walked slowly, his senses alert and his body ready, counting the doorways and side passages as he moved deeper into the maintenance section. And he was not surprised when he heard the sound of footsteps emerging from the darkness behind him. "You actually came," Torvin's voice echoed through the corridor, dripping with amusement and contempt. "I was not sure if you would be stupid enough to walk into such an obvious trap. But I suppose I should not be surprised by the intelligence of a savage." Danny stopped walking and turned around slowly, his face calm and his hands hanging loose at his sides. And he watched as 7 figures emerged from the shadows to form a half-circle around him. Torvin stood at the center, his yellow eyes gleaming in the dim light like twin flames, and his 6 followers spread out on either side of him to block any chance of escape. Danny recognized most of them from his classes. The Krellian with 4 arms who had mocked him in the mess hall, a pair of Selvian twins with skin like polished obsidian, a hulking Gorthian whose species was known for their incredible strength, and 2 others whose names Danny had never bothered to learn 7 against 1. In a dark corridor with no witnesses and no help coming, and every single one of them was bigger and stronger than the lone human standing before them. "This is your last chance to walk away," Danny said, his voice quiet but clear in the humming silence of the maintenance corridor. "I do not want to hurt anyone," Torvin laughed, a harsh and ugly sound that bounced off the metal walls. And his followers joined in with their own mocking laughter as they took another step closer to their prey. "You do not want to hurt anyone?" Torvin repeated, his voice rising with disbelief. "You are one human, surrounded by 7 warriors from species that have been fighting wars since before your ancestors climbed down from the trees. And you think you are in a position to threaten us?" "It is not a threat," Danny said, reaching up to set his bag down gently against the wall. "It is a warning." He rolled his shoulders slowly, feeling the muscles loosen and the old familiar calm settle over his mind like a blanket of fresh snow. And he looked at each of his opponents in turn with eyes that held no fear and no mercy. "My people have a saying," Danny continued, his voice dropping to something soft and almost gentle. "It goes like this: do not start a fight you cannot finish." "Enough talk," the Krellian growled, cracking all 4 of his knuckles with a sound like breaking branches. "Let us teach this human what happens to those who do not know their place." Torvin nodded, his forked tongue flicking out between his teeth as a cruel smile spread across his reptilian face. And he raised one clawed hand in a signal that his followers clearly understood. "Make it hurt," he said, "but do not kill him. I want him to remember this lesson for the rest of his miserable life." The 7 attackers began to close in, their bodies tense and their eyes hungry. And Danny watched them come with the patience of a predator who had been waiting for this moment since the day he arrived at the academy. Thought about all the times he had held back, all the sparring matches where he had pretended to be slower than he was, all the confrontations where he had walked away instead of fighting. And he felt something old and powerful stirring in his chest and earth. Children learn to fight before they learn to read on Earth. Every creature was a predator or prey, and humans had clawed their way to the top of the food chain through millions of years of brutal, unforgiving evolution on Earth. Danny Cole had been a state champion wrestler by the age of 16, had trained in boxing and judo and half a dozen other martial arts, had learned to turn his body into a weapon as deadly as any blade or gun. And now, finally, he was going to show these aliens exactly what a Deathworld produced. "Come on then," Danny said, settling into a fighting stance that looked almost relaxed, but was actually coiled with enough potential energy to level a building. "Let us finish this." Torvin snarled and pointed at the human, and all 7 attackers charged at once, their combined footsteps thundering through the corridor like the drums of war. Danny smiled. And the smile was not friendly at all. It was the smile of a wolf who had finally stopped pretending to be a sheep. Word spread through the Galactic Defense Academy like wildfire through dry grass, whispered from cadet to cadet in mess halls and dormitories and training grounds until there was not a single being on the station who had not heard the story. 7 cadets had tried to ambush the human from Earth. 7 trained warriors from species that prided themselves on their combat abilities. And the human had put all of them down in 12 seconds. 12 seconds. The number became legendary almost overnight, repeated in awed whispers and disbelieving murmurs. And the cadets who had once avoided Danny like he was a dangerous animal now watched him with something closer to wonder than fear. 3 days after the incident, Danny was called to Instructor Velis Cora's office, a small but comfortable room on the upper levels of the academy with a window that looked out on the distant stars. "Please sit," Instructor Velis said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk, and Danny lowered himself into the seat with the careful movements of someone who was not quite sure if he was in trouble. "The security office has completed their investigation into the incident in Maintenance Section 7B. Velis continued, her amber eyes studying Danny's face with an expression he could not quite read. "Do you know what they found?" "No, ma'am," Danny said, keeping his voice neutral and his posture straight. "Nothing," Velis replied, a hint of something that might have been amusement flickering across her silver features. "No camera footage, no witnesses willing to make a statement, and 7 cadets who all insist that they fell down a flight of stairs." Danny blinked, surprised despite himself, and Velis's almost smile grew a little wider. It seems that none of them are eager to admit that they were defeated by a single human, she said, leaning back in her chair. "Their pride will not allow them to tell the truth, even though everyone on this station already knows what really happened. So there will be no charges." Danny asked carefully. "No charges," Velis confirmed. "Against you or against them. Though I have made it very clear to Cadet Shal and his associates that any future incidents will result in immediate expulsion." She paused for a moment, her amber eyes growing more serious, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer and more thoughtful. "I knew this would happen eventually," she said. "Perhaps not exactly like this, but something like it. Some moment when the truth about humans would become impossible to ignore." "What truth is that?" Danny asked. "The truth about why you are here," Velis replied, standing up and walking to the window to gaze out at the stars. "You think you were admitted to this academy because humanity is new to the galactic community and needed representation, or because some bureaucrat wanted to improve interspecies relations." She turned to face him, her silver skin catching the light of distant suns. "But that is not the reason at all." She continued, "You were admitted because the galaxy is changing, because there are threats emerging from the dark spaces between stars that require a different kind of defender than we have ever produced before." "What kind of threats?" Danny asked, his curiosity overcoming his caution. "The kind that cannot be defeated by species who grew up on gentle worlds with stable climates and no predators," Velis said, her voice heavy with implications that Danny could not quite grasp. "The kind that require warriors forged in the crucible of a death world." She walked back to her desk and sat down across from Danny, her amber eyes boring into his with an intensity that made him want to look away. "Humans are special," she said simply, "not because you are stronger or faster or smarter than other species, though in many cases you are, but because you never give up. Because you have been fighting for survival since the first of your ancestors drew breath on that brutal planet you call home. You make it sound like we are weapons," Danny said quietly, remembering Lyra's warning about being used. "No," Velis shook her head firmly. "Weapons are tools, objects with no will of their own, meant only to destroy. But you are not a weapon. Danny Cole, you are a protector. She reached across the desk and placed her hand over his, a gesture of warmth that surprised him from the normally reserved instructor. "The difference is intent," she said softly. "A weapon destroys because it has no choice, but a protector chooses to stand between the innocent and the darkness, chooses to fight for something greater than themselves." Danny was quiet for a long moment, thinking about her words and what they meant for his future. And then he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "At least I think I do." "Good," Velis replied, withdrawing her hand and returning to her professional demeanor. "Now get out of my office and go eat lunch. I believe you will find that the mess hall is a rather different place than it was a week ago." Danny left the instructor's office with her words echoing in his mind. And when he reached the mess hall, he stopped in the doorway and stared his corner table. The one where he had eaten alone for 3 months was no longer empty. Lyra was there, of course, but so were half a dozen other cadets from various species, all of them looking up at Danny with expressions that held curiosity instead of fear, respect instead of contempt. "There he is," Lyra called out, waving him over with a bright smile. "Come sit down, Danny. Everyone wants to hear about Earth." Danny walked slowly to the table, still not quite believing what he was seeing. And as he sat down, the other cadets immediately began peppering him with questions. "Is it true that your planet has creatures that can run faster than our speeders? I heard that humans once walked on your moon using nothing but primitive rockets. Is that real? What does it feel like to live on a world where the gravity is so heavy?" Danny looked around at the eager faces surrounding him, at the genuine interest and admiration in their eyes, and he felt something warm bloom in his chest that he had not felt since leaving Earth. He was not the scary Deathworlder anymore, the monster that everyone avoided and whispered about behind their hands. He was just Danny, a cadet like any other, finally being given the chance to show who he really was. "Well," he said, a smile spreading across his face as he leaned back in his chair, "let me tell you about the time my uncle took me camping in Alaska, and we had to scare off a grizzly bear with nothing but a frying pan and some loud singing." The other cadets leaned in, hanging on his every word, and Danny Cole began to talk about his home later that night. After the mess hall had emptied and the other cadets had gone to their rooms with their heads full of incredible stories about Earth, Danny stood alone on the observation deck and looked out at the stars. Lyra found him there, just like she always did, and she stood beside him in comfortable silence for a long moment before speaking. "So it looks like you finally made some friends," she said, bumping her shoulder against his playfully. Danny laughed, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest, and he nodded slowly. "I guess 12 seconds of honesty worked better than 3 months of silence," he said. "Is that what we are calling it now?" Lyra asked with a grin. "Honesty?" Danny shrugged, his eyes still fixed on the distant stars that suddenly seemed a little less cold and a little less lonely than they had before. "I call it being myself," he said quietly. "For the first time since I got here, I stopped pretending to be less than what I am. And it turns out that was all I ever needed to do." Lyra smiled and linked her arm through his, and together they stood watching the stars spin slowly past a viewport somewhere out there in the darkness. Danny knew there were threats waiting to emerge, dangers that would require everything he had to face. But for now, in this moment, he was content to simply stand with his friend and enjoy the feeling of finally belonging. Had come to the Galactic Defense Academy as an outsider, a Deathworlder feared by everyone around him. But he would leave as something far more important. He would leave as a protector, and that, Danny thought with a smile, was worth every second of the wait. The first attacker was the Morvith, a gray-skinned brute named Krell, who came in swinging with a wild haymaker that would have taken Danny's head off if it had. Connected it. Did not connect. Danny moved with a speed that should have been impossible for a creature from a high-gravity world. ducking under the blow so smoothly that it looked almost lazy. And in the same motion, he grabbed Krell's outstretched arm and used the alien's own momentum to send him spinning face first into the metal wall. The impact rang through the corridor like a bell, and Krell slumped to the floor without a sound. Unconscious before he even knew what had happened, 2 seconds, the Selvian twins came next, attacking together in perfect synchronization like they had practiced this maneuver 1,000 times before. One going high while the other went low in a pincer movement designed to leave no room for escape. Danny dropped to the floor in a controlled fall, sweeping the legs out from under the twin who had gone low. And as that one crashed to the ground, Danny was already rising with an open palm strike that caught the other twin square in the chest. The blow did not look like much, just a simple push with the heel of his hand, but it sent the Selvian flying backward as if he had been hit by a charging bull. And he crashed into his brother just as the first twin was trying to get up. Both of them went down in a tangle of limbs and stayed down, gasping for breath with expressions of pure shock frozen on their obsidian faces. 4 seconds. The Krellian with 4 arms roared and charged forward, all 4 fists swinging in a pattern that should have been impossible to block or dodge. And for a moment, it looked like Danny had finally met an opponent he could not outmaneuver. But Danny did not try to block or dodge. Instead, he stepped directly into the attack, so close that the Krellian's own arms got in each other's way. And before the alien could adjust, Danny had wrapped himself around his opponent like a snake coiling around its prey. The chokehold was simple, efficient, and utterly unbreakable. And the Krellian's 4 arms flailed uselessly as Danny's forearm pressed against his throat, with exactly enough pressure to cut off blood flow without causing permanent damage. 3 seconds later, the Krellian tapped out frantically, his blue face turning purple from lack of oxygen, and Danny released him immediately and let him collapse to the floor. 7 seconds total. The Gorthian and one of the unnamed attackers had been hanging back, watching their companions fall with growing horror. And now they did something that Danny had not expected. They turned and ran. Danny was faster. He caught the Gorthian by the collar of his uniform, spun him around with one hand, and shoved him into the other fleeing attacker with enough force to send them both crashing to the floor in a heap of tangled bodies. They tried to get up, but Danny was already standing over them with his foot planted firmly on the Gorthian's chest, and the look in his eyes made them both freeze like rabbits caught in the gaze of a hawk. "Stay down," Danny said, his voice calm and cold as deep space. "Unless you want to find out what happens when I stop holding back." They stayed down 9 seconds. The last unnamed attacker, a species Danny did not recognize with pale skin and too many joints in all the wrong places, made a desperate lunge for Danny's back while he was focused on the others. Danny heard him coming. Of course, had been tracking his position by sound since the fight began, and he simply stepped to the side and stuck out his foot. The attacker tripped over Danny's extended leg and went sprawling across the floor, sliding on the smooth metal until he crashed into a pile of maintenance equipment. With a clatter that echoed through the corridor, he did not get up. 11 seconds, and then there was only Torvind Felkari, stood alone in the dim light of the corridor, his yellow eyes wide with something that Danny realized with grim satisfaction was pure, undiluted fear. And his clawed hands were shaking as he looked at his fallen companions scattered across the floor like leaves after a storm. "What are you?" Torvin whispered, his voice cracking on the words. "What kind of monster are you?" Danny walked toward him slowly, stepping over the groaning bodies of the other attackers. And he watched as Torvin backed away until his spine pressed against the cold metal wall and he had nowhere left to run. "I told you," Danny said quietly. "I am from a death world." Torvin snarled and swung at Danny with all the strength his species was famous for, a desperate strike that carried enough force to shatter bone. And Danny caught the fist in his bare hand like he was catching a ball thrown by a child. The Valkyrie's eyes went wide as Danny's fingers closed around his fist, and then wider still as Danny twisted his arm into a lock that sent waves of agony shooting through his entire body. Danny kept twisting until Torvin was forced to his knees. Kept pushing until the arrogant bully who had terrorized him for 3 months was kneeling at his feet like a supplicant before a king. 12 seconds, Danny said, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the sudden silence of the corridor. That is how long it took me to put down all 7 of you. And I was not even trying hard. He leaned down until his face was inches from Torvin's, close enough to see his own reflection in those terrified yellow eyes. And when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. On my world, children learn to fight before they learn to read. We grow up surrounded by predators and poisons and 1,000 different ways to die. And we survive because we are the most dangerous things on the entire planet. He twisted Torvin's arm a little more, just enough to make the Valkyrie whimper in pain, and continued speaking in that same quiet, deadly voice I have been holding back since the day I arrived here. Being careful and gentle and slow because I did not want to hurt anyone. Because I wanted to fit in and make friends and prove that humans could be trusted. Danny released the unlock suddenly, and Torvin collapsed to the floor, clutching his injured arm and staring up at the human, with tears of pain streaming down his scaled face. But if you ever threaten me again, Danny said, standing over his fallen enemy like a monument to human resilience. If you ever try to hurt me or my friends or anyone else at this academy, I will not hold back. He reached down and grabbed Torvin by the front of his uniform, lifting the massive Valkyrie off the ground with one hand like he weighed nothing at all. I will show you exactly what a Deathworld can produce, Danny whispered. And you will spend the rest of your life wishing you had never heard the name Danny Cole. He dropped Torvin back to the floor and stepped over him without a second glance, walking back to where he had left his bag against the wall and slinging it over his shoulder like nothing had happened behind him. 7 of the Academy's toughest cadets lay scattered across the floor of the maintenance corridor, groaning and whimpering and trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Danny walked away without looking back, his footsteps echoing through the corridor as he left. The scene of his victory behind, the whole fight had lasted 12 seconds, and Danny Cole had not even broken a sweat.